Let's talk about race, fellow white people. More specifically, let's talk about racism. For us whites, this can be an uncomfortable conversation, but why? Put simply, we are the ones who benefit from racism. Race was an invention of the white elites as a means to control the peasantry. Never before, and nowhere absent of white colonialism, was there such a social construct. Membership in the same race as the aristocracy allowed lower-class peasants of European descent some feeling of worth, importance, value, and most importantly, superiority over those who were not members of this privileged group. It was a calculated means of preserving the lifestyles of the ultra-wealthy and powerful. The faux sense of importance and entitlement, which became apparent in the white peasantry, was the perfect tool to keep the African slave trade going, Jim Crow thriving, and maintains our current system of the mass incarceration of black people. Whites created race, and thus racism. It was our establishment, and it is our responsibility to fight against it and, if possible, dismantle it. Let me take a moment to clarify something. When I talk about racism, I'm talking about what is commonly referred to as systematic racism. Many of you have heard of the term reverse racism. Systematic racism, endemic white supremacy, and white privilege are very real. Reverse racism isn't. It's a fantasy formed by us whites as a means of halting a conversation about racial inequalities. Reverse racism is a disgusting lie, period. White people may be subject to individual acts of prejudice or discrimination, but people of color face an endemic structure of intolerance that envelops every facet of daily life for their entire life, wherever they live, whatever their age, however much money they've acquired, whatever their education. That is systematic racism. There's a commonly referenced formula for racism, and it goes like this: power plus privilege equals racism. I'm a man of facts, evidence, math, science, statistics, and numbers. Things that are real can be observed and measured. Things that cannot be measured are not real. So, if we're going to talk about an issue, we must collectively accept that there's a problem. As it turns out, we don't. 69% of whites don't believe racism is a serious problem. Well, folks, we're wrong. It's a huge problem. In fact, I go so far as to say it is the single greatest burden in humanity. A lot of folks will say, what about issue X? I'd ask this. When you look at any problem, war, famine, pestilence, inequality, and every negative ism there is out there, within those affected by those woes, is it worse for people of color? Is it better for whites? Perhaps better isn't the right word, but certainly the amount of misfortune is varied depending on skin color. Let's look at some numbers. Black people face white supremacy even before birth. In fact, black women don't receive the same prenatal care, and infant mortality is disproportionately high for black babies. Black babies are seen as less innocent than whites as early as preschool. High schools with mostly African American and Latino students are less likely to offer courses in Algebra 2 or chemistry than high schools with mostly white students. Also, our school systems have grown more segregated in recent years, causing great harm to black students. Applicants with black-sounding names are less likely to get called for an interview than those with Anglo-sounding names. Black people are far more likely to be stopped and searched for drugs, although drugs are found more often among whites. Young black men face a greater use of force. They face force more often and are 9 times more likely to be killed by cops than white people. Black people and white people use illegal drugs at similar rates, but black people are far more likely to be arrested for drug use. And once on trial, black people aren't likely to receive their constitutional right to a jury of their peers. Black kids are far more likely to be tried as adults and more likely to receive life sentences. So it should be no surprise to learn black men are more likely to be convicted, with prison sentences 20% longer than white men's for comparable crimes. Furthermore, 1 in 3 black men will be incarcerated in their lifetime. Among those wrongfully convicted and later exonerated by DNA, a disproportionate number are, you guessed it, black. Black former convicts get fewer employer callbacks than white former convicts. When it comes to health care, black people do not receive the same quality of health care at any socioeconomic level, and still, in 2016, have a lower life expectancy than whites. Those are the numbers and the evidence of the sins of white culture. Racism and white privilege are opposing sides of the same coin. Racism is real, and it is a very important topic for us to discuss. It is a huge problem. As a group, whites benefit from generations of inherited wealth dating back to Europe, well before the African slave trade and the theft of native lands, while those groups have suffered. Their economic progress was halted purposefully, systematically. White people have created the concept of race and have profited from racism both individually and collectively. We created the problem, and it's our responsibility to fix it, both within ourselves and our community. Lives are quite literally at risk. These facts are why I say racism is the single greatest problem facing humanity. It is a white invention, thus it's our obligation to confront and fight it. Think of our society as a ship. Some folks will say, because most of us are above water, the ship is sailing just fine. Others will reference the fact that millions are sinking or have already sunk as evidence that we need to take action before we all go under. I say the ship is sinking. Imagine each of society's troubles as a ballast compartment on that ship. All of them have taken on too much water, so we know that something must be done. If every one of our cultural problems is in some way affected by race, then certainly racism is the compartment that is carrying the most weight and thus should be given the greatest urgency. Tides and waves will shift the load in each compartment, and no one is suggesting that all of the focus should only be centered on racism. But until the ship is properly ballasted, or at least balanced and level, we are all in danger, and that weight will pull us under. Racism is so pervasive that it infiltrates every other problem we face. I would never suggest that we set aside all other social justice advocacy. But as you consider the idea of equality, take note of how pervasive the issue of race is. We cannot allow any space for racism to breed. In us, our homes, and our communities, it has taken far too much ground. It's time for white people everywhere to confront it. Let's do so.